necessarily deals in particulars. So that in this first sense, the reconstruction is clearly ideographic, though no less scientific for that. Moreover, the same might have been said, and indeed was said, of attempts, predominantly by North American scholars and going under the rubric of ethnology, to reconstruct chronological sequences of culture on the evidence of distributions of what were then called traits. Now, it was in this sense that Radcliffe-Brown could set aside North American ethnology, which he associated primarily with the work of Franz Boas and his followers, as an ideographic enterprise wholly distinct from his nomothetic social anthropology, which he conceived as a search for general laws governing social life. But while Boasian ethnology was thus being portrayed in Britain as historical rather than scientific, on the other side of the Atlantic, it was being criticized for being scientific rather than historical. And this critique came from Alfred Kroeber. Thoroughly conversant with the writings of the Neo-Kantian school, Kroeber called for an anthropology that would be fully historical and therefore ideographic in the second sense. It must, in short, attend to particulars in terms of their value and meaning. And yet no particular, no thing, no happening can have value and meaning in itself, cut out from the wider context of its occurrence. Each has rather to be understood by way of its positioning within the totality to which it belongs. And so, while preserving its phenomena rather than allowing them to be dissolved into laws and generalizations, the historical approach, in Kroeber's words, finds its intellectual satisfaction in putting each preserved phenomenon into a relation of ever-widening context within the phenomenal cosmos. And he characterized this task of preservation through contextualization as an endeavor at descriptive integration. And as such, it's of an entirely different kind from the task of theoretical integration that Radcliffe-Brown had assigned to social anthropology, because the latter, in order to generalize, must first isolate every particular from its context in order that it can then be subsumed under context-independent formulations. And Kroeber's disdain for Radcliffe-Brown's understanding of history as nothing but a chronological tabulation of such isolated particulars, awaiting the classificatory and comparative attentions of the theorist, bordered on contempt. I do not know the motivation for Radcliffe-Brown's depreciation of the historical approach, Kroeber remarked caustically in an article published in 1945, unless that, as the ardent apostle of a genuine new science of society, he has perhaps failed to concern himself enough with history to learn its nature. Now, although I'm not sure that the terms are the best ones, the distinction between descriptive and theoretical integration is of very great importance, because the two modes of integration entail entirely different understandings of the relation between the particular and the general. The theoretician operating in a nomothetic mode imagines a world that is by its nature particulate. And so the reality of the social world for Radcliffe-Brown comprises an immense multitude of actions and interactions of human beings. And out of this multitude of particular events, the analyst has then to abstract general features that amount to a specification of form. Now, one of the strangest attempts to spell out this procedure appears in a book rather ominously entitled The Theory of Social Structure by the great ethnographer and anthropologist Siegfried Nadel, posthumously published in 1957. Introduced by his friend and colleague Meyer Fortis as a work he wrote destined to be one of the great theoretical treatises of 20th century social anthropology, it was almost instantly forgotten. Its peculiarity lay in its author's use of notation drawn from symbolic logic in order to formalize the move from the concreteness of actually observed behavior to the abstract pattern of relationships. Let us suppose, Nadel postulated, that between two persons, A and B, we observe diverse behaviors denoted by the letters little a, b, c, and so on up to n, but that all index a condition of acting towards, of A acting towards B, and of B acting towards A, and we denote that condition with a colon. It then follows that a formal relationship R exists between A and B, under which is subsumed the behavioral series A to N. Or, in short, A, R, B, if, and the rest. follows. Now, my purpose in recovering this strange formulation from the rightful oblivion into which it quickly fell is only to highlight the sense of integration epitomized in the last line of the formula here by the Greek letter sigma, the sign conventionally used in mathematics to denote a series. The abstract relation here takes the form of a covering statement that encompasses every concrete term in the series. Now, when Kroeber spoke of descriptive integration, he meant something quite different, more akin perhaps to the integration of an artist's picture on the canvas as he paints a landscape. To the artist's gaze, the landscape presents itself not as a multitude of particulars, but as a variegated phenomenal field at once continuous and coherent. And within this field, the singularity of every phenomenon lies in its enfolding, that is, in its position and bearing, and in the poise of a momentarily arrested movement, its enfolding of the entangled histories of relations by which it came to be there at that particular position in that moment. And as the artist tries to preserve that singularity in the work of the brush, so for Kroeber does the anthropologist in his endeavours of description. This is what he meant when he insisted that the aim of anthropology, as of history, must be one of integrating phenomena as such. The integration he was after is one of a world that already coheres, where things and events occur or take place, rather than a world of disconnected particulars that has to be rendered coherent or joined up after the fact in the theoretical imagination. So what Kroeber called the nexus among phenomena is there to be described in the relational coherence of the world. It's not something to be extracted from it, as one might seek the general features of a form from the range of its concrete and particular instantiations. And for precisely that reason, Kroeber thought it would be wrong to regard the phenomena of the social world as complex. Contemplating the landscape, the painter would be unlikely to exclaim, "What a complex landscape this is." And he may be struck by many things, but complexity is not one of them. Nor is it a consideration in the regard of the historically oriented anthropologist. Complexity only arises as an issue in the attempt to reassemble a world already decomposed into elements, as a picture, for example, might be cut up to make a jigsaw puzzle. But like the painter, and unlike the puzzle builder, Kroeber's anthropologist seeks an integration in terms of the totality of phenomena, as he put it, that is ontologically prior to its analytic decomposition. But if the anthropologist describes the social world as the artist paints a landscape, well, then what becomes of time? The world stands still for no one, least of all for the artist or the anthropologist, and the latter's description, like the former's depiction, can do no more than catch a fleeting moment in a never-ending process. But in that moment is compressed the movement of the past that brought it about, and in the tension of that compression lies the force that will propel it into the future. And it's this enfolding of a generative past and a future potential in the present moment, and not the location of that moment in any abstract chronology, which makes it historical. So reasoning along these lines, Kroeber came to the conclusion that time, in the chronological sense, is inessential to history. Presented as a kind of descriptive cross-section, that was his words, or as a characterization of a movement, a historical account can just as well be synchronic as diachronic. And indeed it's precisely to such characterizing description that anthropology aspires. What else can an ethnography be, asked Kroeber rhetorically, than a timeless piece of history? Now, of course, the other side of this argument is that the mere ordering of events in chronological succession, one after another, gives us not history, but science. And Boas, whose painstaking attempts to reconstruct the lines of cultural transmission and diffusion over time had been dismissed by Kroeber as anti-historical, was upset and nonplussed. He confessed to finding Kroeber's reasoning utterly unintelligible. But back in Britain, Kroeber's understanding of what a historical or ideographic anthropology would be like fell on the more sympathetic ears of E. Evans Pritchard. In his Marriott lecture of 1950, entitled Social Anthropology, Past and Present, Evans Pritchard reiterated almost word for word